It was a picture-perfect life for Emily and Jason Westbrook. From the outside, their marriage seemed like the dream that everyone envied. They lived in a charming home on Maplewood Avenue, a quiet suburban street that was dotted with manicured lawns and picket fences. Jason, a software engineer, worked long hours but earned a good salary, allowing Emily to pursue her passion for interior design. They had 2 children, a 10-year-old son named Ben and a 6-year-old daughter named Sophie. Their family was the epitome of success. Smart, successful, and well-liked by their neighbors. They hosted regular gatherings and everyone admired how well they seemed to have it all together. Emily was the picture of grace, always well-dressed and seemingly unflappable. Jason, with his calm demeanor and quiet intelligence, was the perfect complement to his wife's social butterfly persona. To outsiders, it appeared that the Westbrooks had it all: loving children, a beautiful home, and a life others would die for. But beneath the surface, Emily's happiness was beginning to fade. As the years passed, her once passionate love for Jason had slowly withered. The relationship that had started with so much fire and promise had turned into something more like a routine. The late nights Jason spent at work had taken their toll, and Emily found herself feeling neglected, isolated, and longing for something more. The children, though they were a constant source of joy, only added to her feelings of being trapped. She found herself daydreaming about a different life, one that was exciting and full of possibilities. It was around this time that Emily met Victor. He was a man with a magnetic personality, someone who could make her feel like the center of the world. Their first encounter had been at an art gallery opening. Emily had gone with a few friends just to get out of the house when she was drawn to the deep voice and mysterious aura of Victor, who was standing near a painting of a sunset. He was older than her, in his early 40s, with rugged good looks and an air of confidence that made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. Their conversation started off innocently enough, discussing the artwork, but quickly veered into more personal territory. Victor seemed to understand her in a way Jason never had. He didn't talk about work or the kids or anything mundane. He focused on Emily, on her desires and passions, making her feel seen and heard. That night, as she returned home to Jason and the kids, she couldn't stop thinking about him. Her mind raced with excitement and guilt, the 2 emotions battling for dominance in her chest. Over the next few months, Emily found herself meeting Victor again and again. What started as casual coffee dates and late-night phone calls soon turned into something deeper. The more time she spent with Victor, the more she realized just how disconnected she had become from Jason. She was no longer interested in small talk or the quiet, predictable life they had built together. She was craving adventure, something that could make her feel alive again. But she didn't want to admit to herself that she was slipping away from Jason, from everything she had worked so hard to build. She still loved him, in a way, but it was no longer the fiery passion of her youth. It was a quiet, resigned love, a love that had dulled over time. And Victor, with his smooth words and intoxicating presence, made her feel as though she could rediscover that lost part of herself. But she also knew that if Jason ever found out about Victor, it would destroy everything. Still, Emily couldn't help herself. The affair escalated, and as the weeks went by, she found herself spending more time with Victor and less with Jason. She wasn't sure where it would lead, but she was certain of one thing. She was falling deeper into a world that would eventually pull her away from the life she had once cherished. Little did she know, this decision would set in motion a series of events that would end in tragedy and leave her life in shambles. The night of February 8th began like any other. Emily had spent the day running errands, picking up groceries, and making sure the kids were settled at home with their homework. Jason had stayed late at work, which wasn't unusual. The demands of his job often kept him at the office long after their children had gone to bed. It was a Wednesday evening, and Emily had planned to prepare a simple dinner, a roast chicken with potatoes, something comforting to end the day. After the children had finished their meals and gone to bed, Emily went about the routine of tidying up the kitchen. At some point, Emily noticed the time slipping away. Jason was still not home and the house was eerily quiet. She checked her phone, expecting a message or a call, but there was nothing. She felt a wave of frustration wash over her. It wasn't just the late hours, it was the constant feeling of isolation that had begun to creep into her life. In the absence of Jason's presence, she had become more aware of how alone she felt in their marriage. Around 9 p.m., she heard the front door open, followed by Jason's footsteps on the wooden floor. He came into the kitchen, his briefcase in hand, his tie loosened around his neck. He looked tired, but there was a warmth in his eyes as he greeted her. "Long day?" he murmured, dropping his things onto the counter. "Yeah, I can tell," Emily replied, not looking at him. There was a distance in her voice, a lack of warmth that Jason didn't seem to notice. He moved to the fridge and poured himself a glass of water. Emily was still putting away the dishes, deliberately avoiding eye contact. As Jason took a sip from his glass, Emily felt a strange sense of detachment, as though she was watching a stranger in her own home. They had been married for years, yet in that moment, she felt more like a housemate than a wife. She had tried to push away the thoughts of Victor, of the secret life she had been leading, but tonight they were louder than ever. Without warning, the sudden sound of a gunshot shattered the stillness of the room. Emily froze, her heart racing. The noise had come from Jason's study, the room at the end of the hallway. For a moment, Emily stood motionless, uncertain of what had just happened. Was it a mistake? Had something fallen, causing the loud noise? But then she heard the muffled sound of Jason's voice calling out her name, and everything inside her clicked into place. Panicking, Emily rushed to the study, where the sight before her froze her in place. Jason was slumped over his desk, his body lifeless. Blood pooled around him, staining the papers he had been working on. His face was pale, eyes wide open in shock, a single gunshot wound to his chest. Emily's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she couldn't comprehend what had happened. Her mind raced, and in a blur of confusion she reached for her phone and dialed 911. The operator answered quickly, her calm voice a sharp contrast to Emily's frantic tone. "My husband! He's been shot! Please, help me!" she cried, her words coming out in a panicked rush. Emily could barely make sense of what she was saying. She just knew that Jason was gone, and there was no way to undo what had just occurred. The police arrived within minutes, their sirens wailing through the quiet neighborhood. Emily stood outside the house, her arms wrapped tightly around her body as she tried to compose herself. Officers entered the house, assessing the scene with practiced efficiency. Emily's children were still asleep in their rooms, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding just a few feet away. As the investigation began, Emily's story remained unchanged. She insisted that she had been in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard the gunshot. She had immediately rushed to the study to find Jason already dead. The officers examined the study for clues, but there was no sign of forced entry or anything out of place. The windows were locked, the door was closed. It looked like a targeted killing, yet there were no obvious suspects. Despite her hysteria, Emily's behavior seemed oddly controlled. She wasn't crying uncontrollably, as many would expect from a wife who had just lost her husband in such a violent manner. Her hands shook, her voice wavered, but something about her demeanor made the investigators pause. Was she hiding something? The thought lingered in the back of their minds as they continued to piece together the puzzle of Jason's death. The investigation had just begun, but already questions were beginning to form. Who could have done this? And more importantly, why? The investigation into Jason Westbrook's death was moving at a slow, steady pace. Detectives combed through the Westbrook home, carefully examining the scene for any clues that might point to a suspect. Emily, still in shock over her husband's murder, had been questioned repeatedly, her story unchanged. She had been in the kitchen when she heard the shot, and by the time she reached Jason's study, it was too late. She had found him slumped over his desk, already gone. The lack of evidence suggesting a break-in was perplexing. Nothing had been stolen, and there were no signs of a struggle. The front door had been locked, the windows secure. Jason's valuables, including his wallet and phone, remained untouched. It seemed that whoever had killed him had known exactly where to find him, almost as if they were familiar with the house. And yet, no one seemed to know of anyone who would have wanted to harm Jason. The detectives turned their focus to Emily, given that she had been the one to discover the body. They re-examined her alibi, making sure it held up under scrutiny. Emily had insisted that she had been in the kitchen, cooking dinner, when the gunshot rang out. The children, Ben and Sophie, were asleep, and there was no one else around to corroborate her story. The investigators questioned her neighbors, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. But most reported nothing out of the ordinary. It was the following day, when detectives were going through Jason's personal items, that they uncovered something unexpected. Jason had kept a meticulous record of his life, including his finances, emails, and even personal notes. As they sifted through his email inbox, they came across a few messages that stood out. One in particular caught their attention. A series of emails from a man named Victor. They were cordial at first, discussing mutual interests in art and design, but as the months went by, the tone of the messages became more intimate. There were references to meeting up in person, personal conversations, and flirtatious comments. It didn't take long for the investigators to realize that Emily had been having an affair. They dug deeper into Victor's background and discovered that he was an artist who had moved to Maplewood about a year earlier. He was relatively new to the area, but he was well known in certain circles, particularly among people who frequented the local art gallery. Emily had met him there months before, and what started as a casual meeting soon blossomed into an affair. As the detectives followed the trail of evidence, they began to piece together a more complicated picture. Emily's affair with Victor had been more than just a passing fling. It had been an escape, a way for Emily to rediscover the excitement and passion that had gone missing from her marriage. But the more they learned about Victor, the more troubling the situation became. Victor wasn't just some charming artist. He had a darker side. Interviews with people who knew him painted a picture of a man who was obsessive and demanding. He had a history of getting involved with women who were already in relationships, and when things didn't go his way, he could be ruthless. Detectives began to wonder if Victor had played a role in Jason's death. Had he pushed Emily to do something drastic, to eliminate the man standing in the way of their future together? They learned that in the weeks leading up to Jason's murder, Victor had become increasingly frustrated with Emily's inability to leave her husband. He had been pressuring her to make a decision, to choose him over Jason. In some of their private conversations, he had made veiled threats, urging her to act before things got too complicated. As the investigation deepened, the pieces started to fit together in a chilling way. Emily's affair with Victor, combined with the tension building in their relationship, was enough to raise suspicion. The detectives decided to look more closely at Emily's movements in the days before the murder, hoping to uncover any evidence that would tie her to the crime. They discovered that just days before Jason's death, Emily had made some unusual purchases. A local gun shop receipt showed that she had bought ammunition and cleaning supplies for a firearm. An odd purchase, considering that Jason's gun had been kept locked away in his study. The evidence was mounting, and with each new discovery, the detectives became more certain that Emily knew more than she was letting on. The question now was whether she had been the one to pull the trigger. Could it be that she had killed Jason, not just to be with Victor, but to free herself from a life she had grown increasingly resentful of? Or had Victor pushed her to the brink, manipulating her into committing the unthinkable? The investigation was far from over, but the detectives had uncovered a crucial piece of the puzzle. The focus had shifted. The question no longer was whether Emily knew something, but how much she was willing to confess. The truth was out there, and it was just a matter of time before the full story would come to light. A week had passed since Jason's death, and the investigation had progressed, but the answers seemed to be slipping further away. Emily's grief had not wavered, but the detectives' suspicions about her involvement were growing. The more they uncovered about her affair with Victor, the more they began to question whether her emotions were genuine or if she was simply putting on a mask of sorrow. Something didn't sit right with them. Her composure, her refusal to crack under questioning, and the mounting evidence that linked her to the crime. It was on February 15th when the breakthrough came. The investigators had continued to dig into the circumstances surrounding Jason's murder, and their relentless pursuit of details began to pay off. Surveillance footage from a local gas station just a few miles from the Westbrook home became a key piece of the puzzle. A security camera had captured footage of a car that matched the description of Victor's vehicle. The timestamp on the video showed that the car had been parked at the station at around 8:50 p.m., the exact time Emily had claimed she was in the kitchen when the gunshot rang out. The footage didn't end there. In a surprising twist, the camera had also recorded a brief interaction between Emily and Victor. The two were seen standing together near the car, exchanging words before getting into the vehicle and driving off. The investigators had a new theory. Could it be that Emily and Victor had orchestrated the murder together, or had she acted alone, meeting Victor afterward for support? The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. Emily had not mentioned meeting Victor that night. When confronted with the footage, she seemed caught off guard, her face draining of color as the truth began to sink in. Her story, once so carefully constructed, was starting to unravel. At first, Emily denied the meeting, insisting that it had been an innocent encounter, nothing more than a chance meeting at the gas station. But the police weren't convinced. They knew the timing was too coincidental. Emily had been home when Jason was shot, yet here she was, on camera, with Victor just minutes before the gunshot rang out. Something wasn't adding up. As the evidence mounted, the detectives took another step forward. They turned their attention to the gun. Emily had insisted that she had no knowledge of Jason's firearm being involved in his death. However, when they examined the weapon in Jason's study, they found traces of fingerprints. Emily's fingerprints. It wasn't just a light touch. It was clear that the gun had been handled recently. Emily's initial shock had turned to frustration. She realized the walls were closing in on her. She began to withdraw, avoiding the investigators and trying to make sense of the mess she had created. The police, however, were methodical in their approach, refusing to let her off the hook. They continued to press her, and eventually they were able to secure a second round of questioning. This time, Emily's demeanor was different. She was no longer the helpless widow, the woman who had been wronged by fate. She had grown defensive, her responses guarded and cold. The detectives sensed she was holding something back, and it didn't take long for them to break her down. Faced with the mounting evidence and the surveillance footage, Emily cracked. She confessed, though not immediately in full detail. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "but I couldn't live with him anymore. I wanted out. Victor, he promised me everything." But her confession wasn't the whole truth. Emily spoke haltingly, giving only vague details, and tried to downplay Victor's involvement. She claimed that the murder had been a spur-of-the-moment decision, but the detectives weren't buying it. They knew that her calm and calculated behavior leading up to the murder pointed to something more than just a rash act. It became clear that Emily had planned the murder. She had been carefully setting the stage, buying the ammunition and gun supplies, and meeting Victor to ensure the plan was in place. The affair, combined with her dissatisfaction with Jason and her desperation for a fresh start with Victor, had driven her to take the life of the man who had once been her partner. But where did Victor fit into all of this? Emily's confession hinted at his influence, but did not implicate him directly. When the police questioned him further, his involvement became undeniable. He had not only been aware of Emily's plans, but had also provided her with encouragement and advice. It was becoming clear that while Victor hadn't physically pulled the trigger, he had been the catalyst for Emily's decision. Emily's confession and the damning evidence were enough for the police to make an arrest. As they escorted her out of her home, the cold reality of what had transpired began to hit the family and friends who had been left in the wake of Jason's murder. The quiet, suburban neighborhood that had once seemed like the ideal place to raise a family was now a place of shock and grief. Emily, the woman who had seemed so perfect, was now facing a future that could only be filled with regret and punishment. The arrest was only the beginning. The trial would reveal the full extent of her betrayal, but for now, the haunting image of the perfect wife turned cold-blooded murderer was etched into the minds of everyone who had known her. As Emily was led away from her home in handcuffs, The weight of her actions seemed to settle over her like a suffocating cloud. The small suburban neighborhood that had once been the backdrop of her seemingly perfect life now buzzed with whispers and disbelief. Neighbors who had once exchanged pleasantries with her on sunny afternoons now looked at her with a mix of shock and suspicion. Emily had been the picture of grace, the devoted wife and loving mother. The truth behind Jason's death shattered that illusion, and now everyone who had once admired her found themselves grappling with the dark reality of what had transpired. In the days following her arrest, Emily's trial became the talk of the town. The courtroom was packed with reporters, friends, and family members who had been affected by Jason's death in one way or another. Emily's defense attorney tried to paint the picture of a woman who had been trapped in an unhappy marriage, someone who had been manipulated by the charismatic and controlling Victor. The defense argued that while Emily had made the fatal decision to pull the trigger, she had been pushed to the brink by Victor's influence, by her deep dissatisfaction with her life, and by the emotional neglect she had suffered at the hands of her husband. But the prosecution wasn't buying it. They painted a much darker picture, one of premeditation and deceit. The evidence was overwhelming. The surveillance footage showing Emily and Victor meeting just before the murder, the gun with her fingerprints on it, and the chilling emails exchanged between her and Victor in the months leading up to Jason's death. The prosecution argued that Emily had planned the murder for weeks, carefully crafting a story that would make her appear innocent. She had been the mastermind behind the crime, and Victor, though complicit, was ultimately not the one who had pulled the trigger. Throughout the trial, Emily remained stoic. She seemed detached from the proceedings, her once radiant beauty now overshadowed by the stark reality of her situation. Her eyes never once betrayed any emotion as the evidence against her piled up, piece by piece. It wasn't until the final days of the trial that Emily began to break down. As she sat in the witness stand, facing the consequences of her actions, her calm demeanor began to fracture. The tears came, slowly at first, but they grew more frequent, more uncontrollable. Emily seemed to realize, perhaps for the first time, the full weight of what she had done. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she said, her voice trembling. "I was just trying to escape. I didn't want to hurt him. I didn't want anyone to get hurt, but I felt trapped. I thought I had no other choice." The words hung heavy in the air, but they did little to sway the jury. They had already seen the evidence, heard the testimony from experts who explained how Emily had carefully orchestrated the murder, convinced that her life would be better on the other side of her husband's death. The prosecution reminded the jury that Emily had been living a double life, hiding her affair from her husband, all while plotting his demise. Victor, who had been charged as an accessory to murder, sat silently in the courtroom. His trial was set to begin after Emily's, but his role in the crime was already clear. While he hadn't directly participated in the murder, he had pushed Emily to make the fatal decision. He had promised her a life without Jason, one where they could build a future together. But it was clear that Victor's intentions were darker than Emily had ever realized. He had preyed on her vulnerabilities, feeding her dissatisfaction and pushing her further into the depths of betrayal. As the trial concluded, the jury deliberated for hours. Emily sat in the defendant's chair, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for the inevitable verdict. The evidence was too overwhelming for the jury to ignore. They returned with a guilty verdict on all counts, first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The sentence would be decided later, but there was little doubt that Emily would spend the rest of her life behind bars. The courtroom was silent as the judge declared the sentence. Emily's family, who had been supportive of her throughout the trial, now sat in stunned silence. Her children, Ben and Sophie, were left with a future that no one could have predicted. The woman who had once been their mother was now a convicted murderer. Their lives would never be the same, and they would have to navigate a world without the woman they had once loved. Outside the courtroom, the media swarmed. The story of the unfaithful wife who had murdered her husband to be with her lover had captivated the public. The details of the case were all too familiar. A woman unhappy in her marriage, an affair, and a deadly decision that changed everything. Emily's name became synonymous with betrayal and murder, a tragic reminder that sometimes The desire for something more can lead to unimaginable consequences. As Emily was escorted away in handcuffs, the gravity of her choices hung heavily in the air. Her life, once filled with dreams of a new future with Victor, was now reduced to the cold reality of prison. The truth was clear now. She had made a choice, and that choice had cost her everything. The dream of a perfect life had turned into a nightmare, and it was one she could never escape. The months that followed Emily's conviction were marked by an unsettling. The once vibrant life she had built with Jason was now a distant memory, replaced by the cold, harsh reality of prison walls. Her days were spent in isolation, far removed from the life she had once known. No longer was she the beloved wife and mother in a picture-perfect home. Instead, she was just another inmate in a system that had no place for the woman she had once been.